That's a little bit about the Carver and the core exhibit. Um, Faith Weaver, as education coordinator, what were some of the challenges and some of the exciting work that you got to do in creating curriculum for the exhibit?
The challenge obviously has been that we've been working from home over the last year. So, doing virtual programming and being able to connect to staff virtually to add to presence. And then the focus on the fact that we had a core exhibit on Juneteenth for a long time. So, when we opened the museum in 2005 and we had 2,000 people coming to the museum, we had this core exhibit on Juneteenth, which the Carver was the first facility to have a core exhibit on Juneteenth. But it was an exhibit we had for a long time. So people would come, it's like, we've seen this. Um, and the staff could like recite to you different parts of that exhibit. So the fact that we were able to create an extension of Juneteenth and what that means. And then what Carrie was talking about, you saw our Freedom Plaza, you saw the 5 statues that make up that Freedom Plaza. And those statues tell the story of Juneteenth. So that the fact that we went for something that was a part of our mission statement, Juneteenth, and we're able to expand it to all the things that you're going to see me talk about in this video about what presence is, was remarkable. The beauty of the opening of presence, like Laura said, we opened it right before the pandemic began, and we opened it on the last day of Black History Month, and we didn't know what was going to happen at that time, but there was such a pride in that opening for the staff. The staff felt like we were at another level as a museum. When you think of a museum, you think of something grand, and presence is a reflection of that grandness for the Carver and the growth that we're going through. New leadership and Carrie Adams, um, the bond. We are going into phase 2 after 15 years. So the Carver has gone from being in that little building of 1,800 square feet to being in our 36,000 square foot facility to going to a 90,000 square foot facility in the future. So I'm really proud of that. I've been at the Carver for 21 years. And so I've been in that little building. I've been in the building that we are right now. And, you know, regardless of whether I'm there for that growth that we're going through, I'm really proud of the work that we do in community and what the Carver is going to continue to be in our community. Hello, everyone. I'm Faith Weaver, Education Coordinator at the George Washington Carver Museum, Cultural and Genealogy Center. And I'm going to share with you today elements of our Presence Learning Lab and how to use it as a resource for ethnic studies lessons with your students. Presence, the African American presence in 19th century Texas, is the Carver's new core exhibit. We opened the exhibition on February 29, 2020, right before the pandemic began. That evening, hundreds of guests viewed artifacts from the George Washington Carver Museum collection, such as African masks and statues. And these are some of the ones that are featured in the African Impulse and African American Culture section of the exhibit. They also were able to see some of the domestic and spiritual artifacts that are a part of our collection. A little bit later today, we're going to have an interactive activity to explore some more of these photos. Presence was co-curated by Bombadeli Demerson, the former manager of the Carver Museum, former manager curator of the Carver Museum, and Carrie Adams, the current manager and curator of the Carver Museum. And they had direction from Laura Esparza, the Division Manager of Museum and Cultural Programs for the City of Austin Parks and Recreation Department. And here's an image of the three of them. You have Carrie Adams, Bombadella Demerson, and Laura Esparza. And this image is an overview to give you like a little taste of what our patrons and guests were able to enjoy when we opened this exhibit on the 29th. Presence is made up of 5 sections. There's the African Impulse on African American Culture, Slavery in Texas, Freedmen's Communities in Texas, the Reconstruction Era, and a history and celebration of Juneteenth. Presence expands the reach of our former core exhibit on Juneteenth with the inclusion of this additional content. In order to understand the cultural heritage of Blacks living in Texas, we first focus presence on their roots and societies on the continent of Africa with the African impulse on African American culture. The African forebearers of Black people in the Americas include the Yoruba, the Ashanti, the Ewe, the Igbo, and the Congo, as well as numerous societies based in the western and central regions of the ancestral continent. This leads into the impact of slavery in Texas, the creation of freedmen's communities, the Reconstruction Era that featured African American legislators. And this is our wall of African American legislators. This, the artwork for this was done for us by Jonathan Casares. And this is one of the many examples in Presence that feature artists of color that created special artwork for the core exhibit. So we go from the Reconstruction Era that features the African American legislators to the history and celebration of Juneteenth. Juneteenth is a signature event of the Carver Museum. And last year we did it for the first time virtually, and we'll be doing that again this year. So we'll spotlight our second virtual Juneteenth on June 19, 2021. Please save the date for that. The Presence Education and Activity Guide is an educator's resource with pre- and post-tour activities, vocabulary words, questions for consideration that serve as footnotes for learning, and reflection questions that are based on MindPop's Creative Learning Initiative categories. So there are observations, content connections, and personal connections. In the Slavery in Texas segment of the booklet, there are observation question I want you to think about is, what was life like for African Americans in Texas prior to the 1800s? A question to think about under content connections is, what emotions do you think African American children experienced when they were sold off into slavery? And there is an activity that's connected to MindPop 2 that we have that goes with this image called a stage picture. So what do you see in the picture? What do you notice about this image or find unusual? What does this image communicate about the life during the 19th century? How does this image connect to your life? What else are you curious about? So not only are we looking at various MindPop elements with the Creative Learning Initiative, I've asked you questions about observations and content connections. The personal connection question to consider is, today we face global issue of human trafficking. How is it similar to slavery? So for each of the 5 sections of Presence, there are 3 Creative Learning Initiative categories that we're asking you to think about and talk to your students about and how they connect to ethnic studies. The Carver is using Creative Learning Initiative and creative teaching methods for tour activities and creation of educational content. We also are a MindPop vendor, and we're using that as a way to get more out there to you as educators that you could use with your students too. We hope that in addition to exploring this Presence Learning Lab and the other learning labs that we have on the Carver Museum ATX for the Smithsonian, that you also will visit us in person to see Presence for yourself when we reopen soon. Thank you.
Yes, we can put a direct link in for not just this collection, but the videos and the learning guide. Later on today, just before we close, we're going to be joined by a representative from MindPop, who we work very closely with. MindPop is also called the Creative Learning Initiative. And Krista is our fiscal sponsor for this program, and she's going to be introducing you to MindPop's resources. I'll turn it over to Chris to continue the discussion.
When you are looking at the video that Carrie Adams, our chief curator and culture and arts manager, presented, and some of the imagery of what was presented in the video that I shared about the learning lab, I saw this wall, and the wall of it was a wooden wall that was specially created for the museum, weighed over a ton, and it has the waves that represent the Middle Passage, and it has these images of Black people and all of our beauty and all of our challenges and all of our resiliency. So the image that Chris and I are going to talk about is something that was new to me, you know, convict leasing, and the fact that Black men were responsible for building the Capitol. You know, we know that our Black ancestors worked on the creation of the White House, but I didn't know that that they were involved in the way that they were in our state capitol. So that gives you a different perspective when we're able to go back in there. And then the convict leasing, I was like, what, you know, what is that? So the fact that I'm still able to have opportunities to have to learn, and that we have that gift that we're able to continue to learn and grow, and that you can look at convict leasing and you can look at the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, but it also, you know, there was like this language that talked about if people were imprisoned. So with the convict leasing, that's an example of that. And that was something that I didn't know about. So the image that you're going to see are men who were imprisoned that were brought in to do the work at the Capitol. And, you know, we'll talk more about what they look like. But there were minor infractions that people were imprisoned by. And so it makes me think about what happened to them and what their response was to knowing that they did the creation of that and seeing that building be built and what they thought about their contributions to that. So I hope that's a good tie-in to everything. But one of the challenges that we're going to have with Presence, you know, it has to do, you know, we're looking at the 19th century, and we know what was happening during that time. So there was enslavement of Black people. How do you like look at the positives in that? And what are we going to do to engage the youth to see that, I mean, our story goes beyond that, but that's also like the foundation of our story. And there's so much that it reflects so much around how strong our ancestors were and what stock we come from, and to have pride in that. And so anyway, so I'm touching on a lot of different things, but one of the things that we're like thinking about and what we're going to talk to patrons and young people about is those questions. And I'm really open to getting y'all's opinions about that as well, you know, because we're touching on slavery, but we're also touching on freedom and those freedom and communities. We're looking at the African-American legislators that existed. And there were some things that they were challenged with as well. So there's a lot of foundations to build upon and work with. So I would like y'all's input as well as other things we could do to make sure that it's a full experience for everybody that comes into that space.
So I think what you're finishing there, Faith, is really, for me, the way we talk about it, is centering the African American experience and the importance, I think, for all of ethnic studies, but I think particularly for, as we talk about the Black experience, of how much of our curriculum does not center the African American experience. Too often they say what students have gotten in history is slavery and Martin Luther King,
Mm-hmm.
and that's it. And both of those are taken from the white experience. And so the challenge for us really is within and really where a lot of work has been done within African American education has been really thinking about Afrocentricity and how do we repurpose the curriculum to center a Black experience now, in the past, and in the current, and celebrating. I think this is, Faith, what Carver has done throughout its history, celebrating. And what I hear and what we've seen already is y'all have really, in your collections, have really focused on that. So that was really exciting to see all the wonderful ways that you've taken on this challenge and think about how can we center the Black experience with our students. And then the second piece that y'all do, I thought, really well, is talking about centering African American resistance. And so those are the two kind of pedagogical notes that I really want to focus on before we get back to thinking about this incredible convict leasing picture. Is what does that look like? Just very briefly, because of time.
Mm-hmm.
So recognizing that this is really brief, I'm just going to go through these slides really quickly. But this whole idea of what ethnic studies allows us to do is sort of bring in the critical thinking that we think about in Bloom's taxonomy and the social consciousness of social studies through critical pedagogy. And critical pedagogy is taken in many different ways, but the core of critical pedagogy really is having that dialogue with us as teachers, getting our students to become more socially aware of their surroundings, transitioning from the individual awareness to the social awareness, and then that dialogue happening between social awareness and individual critique, so that we eventually can get into social critique. And so the example I use is, how do we move from this acknowledgement of high school that school sucks, yes, school sucks, moving that on to, okay, so we have residential segregation, we have high school tracking. That's our job as teachers to let them know a little bit more about what's going on in their local world, and then giving them time to start thinking about, okay, can high school be different? What can high school be different? And so we have kind of these two axes of helping our students with critique, but moving from internal critique, where they do their internal reflection, and moving it on into external critique. And so this is what theorists have called resistance theory, and it's recognizing that throughout our time period, we've all had different kinds of resistance, and how do we celebrate all four kinds of these resistance? They talk about individual awareness, moving on to collective resistance, thinking back to reflexive change, and then going back to the collective resistance. And so this general idea is making sure that we celebrate all four forms of resistance throughout history, and recentering and rethinking about what were the different ways that people who have experienced oppression resisted the oppression, and celebrating and learning to recognize that. So it's just a different way to talk about resistance. One thing that I want to make sure that people have access to, UT has done a great job of their website. I want to make sure, new share, let's see, where are we? Are people familiar with Teaching Texas Slavery? This website. So this is a nice site that really tries to rethink how we can have a more Afrocentric approach to slavery. As slavery as part of the social construction of race. And so as we start thinking about this, how we can use this to think about racialized social system, institutional racism, all the way to critical race theory. I'm not going to get into all the details, but where this sort of brings us to, and where I'm going into thinking about how slavery was an institutionally racist system, but also part of a larger racialized social system of of the oppression of African Americans, of labor, and how all these things interconnect. But our job within critical race theory is then to start telling counter stories to what we call the white stream curriculum that abounds in U.S. history. And so this is where the Smithsonian, this is where Faith does a wonderful job, and this is where we really need to take advantage of the Carver resources. And what a lot of y'all have done, and it is use these primary documents um, um, to really start the counter storytelling of stories of resistance. And so this provides a nice pedagogical framework that integrates both social studies and critical race theory to think about any topic, but specifically about slavery, um, and rethink that about how we can teach race and slavery in a way that focuses what a lot of scholars are talking soul values. What are the different values? There's this values that capitalism has imposed, that white supremacy has imposed on our students. How can we how can we talk about different values, the soul values that emerge from the African American tradition? And so this moves us on to what we're going to talk about right now, and how we can use this image to start thinking about both resistance and soul values. Many different ways to talk about resistance. And so very quickly, just to sort of start thinking of some of the ideas, what I'm going to want to do though is then for y'all to then respond and for Faith to respond, but just to give you some ideas of the different ways that we can talk about different forms of resistance. You started hearing some of the questions, thinking about it from the perspective of the convicts that were forced to build the Capitol. What forms of individual resistance, pride in our own labor, but also the symbolic resistance. How can we write different histories of this time period? We can use slave narratives most definitely for talking about that. The battle over the monuments, I think, has been really, at least for me, been really fertile ground with my students in the last year, talking about collective resistance and how that has emerged. And then finally, having the students basically go in. There's so much of the African American Austin history that is not known, that still is to be written. And so very much, how can we as a community rewrite? And this is where the Carver Center works so well. And so I have certain sites to do that, but I want to sort of take this back to Faith and
I keep thinking about their humanity as I'm looking at that picture. Their stature in there, you know, you look at that. I mentioned the 13th Amendment and how it had a loophole, and some people look at it as a new kind of slavery because the loophole was being in the prison system, and those men were in the prison system. So it goes back to my question about, you know, did they know what they were doing? Were they able to see the work of their hands? Because they, you know, here it is decades later that we have this monument to government in our city that was created by Black men in the situation that they were in. So I think about their humanity, and, you know, in the video that we featured with Carrie, you saw some of the pictures of people that were taken that shared what it was like for them when they found out that they were freed, people that were enslaved, and you see how it aged them, how is powerful, to see them. And in that present exhibit, you get to hear their words, you get to see them, and we put them on like silk. So there's a lot of like, symbolic things that we're trying to be mindful of in the presence exhibit. The blood-stained ship image that had the feet. We all saw what our ancestors were when they were in the slave ships and how that was. But the artist that created that wanted to show how precious that cargo was. So again, it goes back to our humanity, the humanity of those enslaved people, the humanity of those men who were imprisoned. And I think that's something that we could look at and think about in looking at that image.
So to finish up, I just want to give y'all a good 3, 4, 5 minutes because the collective wisdom in this room is just so incredible. Do we have a big version of that picture so we can put it up there? And then in the chat for y'all to start thinking about what are good themes to use this. I think they're most definitely the new Jim Crow, certainly. What are those connections, that personal connections we're making with our students? What are forms of resistance that we can talk with our students? And so 3 main things: themes, key questions, and then key personal connections. Y'all can see that, right?
Yes.
All right, so let's give y'all some, thank you, Laura, themes, key questions, and then personal connections.
Can you make it slightly larger, Chris?
Mm-hmm. Oops, too much.
Yeah. Okay.
There we go.
That's good. Thank you.
Does that work or not?
Yes, it does.
That's better?
Yeah.
All right.
One of the themes, I worked very closely with Bonilla Demerson, the curator, as we were writing the exhibit. It took about 2.5 years to write this exhibit. And one of the reasons why we started the exhibit with the African roots, the African impulse, was to make the point that the people who were stolen and brought to this country were skilled. They had built cities, they had industries, they had spirituality, there was dimension to cultures. And so they were stolen in part because they brought skill sets to this country. And so one of the things that this picture makes me think about are the many different skill sets that Africans brought with them when they were kidnapped and brought to this country.
It also brings to mind like those unknown stories. Like I was telling y'all, I didn't know about the convict leasing. And I was talking to a friend last night about the fact that Black men that were in prison built the Capitol, and they didn't know about that. So there's still, and Chris touched on this too, there's still these stories that we don't know about that we need to unearth and tell those stories. And, as the Carver being a Black institution, that's a great responsibility that we have to do that. You can kind of see that the setting of that is in a town close to Austin, that they're mining that limestone from to create those columns that are the great columns of the Capitol. And of course, you could look at, thank you, Makina. So what is a criminal? Debunking stereotypes, creating multifaceted humans.
Yeah, Faith, if you could be in charge of the chat, I can't see the chat when I have it.
Okay, gotcha. So Makina was saying, what is a criminal? debunking stereotypes, creating multifaceted humans. Brittany shared that you can look at the expression and she sees dignity despite the circumstances, their fighting spirit. Julian said theme of exploitation on labor. Travis shared that it makes him wonder what other things have happened for government to benefit that took advantage of African Americans and other immigrant groups, minority groups. And it makes them think about the Chinese immigrants building the Transcontinental Railroad. Tara shared making connections to the current prison industrial complex. Yes, definitely so, Tara. And then Jennifer shared about a recent story in Fort Bend ISD, the Sugarland 95. So there were 95 bodies of prisoners that were found in Sugarland that are connected to what happened to these men that are in this picture. And it's thought that they were in the same circumstance. So she shared that link in the chat. Makina also says the Panama Canal and Asian workers. So it makes you think of when we're talking about ethnic studies, it makes you think of all the ethnicities that have been affected in different ways, and the work that those different peoples did to build our country up. Whitney shares more on unknown stories. Who are these men? What were their convictions? How were they ripped from their lives and made to do this? How does our current social media culture information sharing attempt to expose what would have been unknown stories of exploitation and injustice?
And then send them to the History Center.
Yeah. Yeah.
Send them to the Carver.
Yeah, the Austin History Center is definitely a great resource. Brittany says the Transcontinental Railroad using minorities to create infrastructure.
Carlin had a comment up above too, also connecting to history of policing in the US.
Yes. Let's see. See, I want to find those pillars at the Capitol. It is so strange that I can put my hands on what those men built.
Taking pictures, big pictures of what those look like now.
Mm-hmm. Brianne talks about theme, historical memory, thinking about how most people likely do not know the story. What do we choose to remember about our history? Who makes those decisions? And Roberto talks about global connections of US imperialism and global white supremacy. Going back to what Brianne said about who makes those decisions, Chris, I know we were talking about initially in our talk about this, that, you know, the lion writes a story and until like that story is told in a different way. We're touching on the ways that those stories need to be told in different ways. And so, you know, we have to tell stories from the eyes of one of my friends always talks about the dominant narrative. So we have to look outside the dominant narrative to tell those stories in different ways. So let's see, Jennifer. Sometimes we hear people say that the system is broken, but in reality, systems function as designed. Oppression does not just happen, it is designed and implemented.
Exactly.
And Black incarceration today, Alshon. Correct. Yeah. You know, it's yeah, there's so much truth in that, just in that statement, period. And just like how we see so many Black peoples in prison, there's like a big percentages that are shown with that. And when you go through that, being able to come back, how your rights are affected from that.
Talk about it from the pre-K to prison pipeline also. I mean, this is not an accident, this is a system. And I think that's where having those resources of the teaching Texas labor really helps us build those connections in terms of talking about our own schools, how they create systems of incarceration. university use of that labor. So I think connecting all those connections and making those connections. I feel there is so much here, and this is a hard time to move on, but we want to make sure to give all of you time also to think about what our next steps are. So I need to start moving on to the next activity. Faith, before we do that, I love your lion story. My other question is also talk a little bit more, because we are starting to talk about, with all that's going in with Black Lives Matter, with acknowledging the George Floyd. I think there's a lot that is going on right now. There are a lot of connections that can be made. So I most definitely want to. I think I want to leave kind of the last words to you before we move on to the next section.
The moment we had last week of seeing the verdict on Chauvin, and the fact that we know what he did, we saw what he did, and the fact that we had that moment where we were sitting up there looking at that, and there was a concern that there still wasn't going to be justice done in that circumstance. So it was a moment that, you know, we had a collective like holding in a breath, and we were able to kind of let some of that out. But the fact that we've had one instance of justice, and we have so many others that need to still happen. It's astounding to me, because I remember when Trayvon Martin, the verdict of the man that killed Trayvon Martin, and when that happened. So the fact that we had that experience together, that moment together, and there was a fear that the right decision wasn't going to be made. We have a long way to go. And the fact that we're able to have Black institutions, and institutions like the Asian American Resource Center, who we're dealing with AAPI hate. We're just dealing with, our world is something else. So we're dealing with a lot of things, and it's very important for us to be mindful and aware of that history, and change that. I talked about the dominant narrative later, but change that narrative to where we're not seeing something like that, where we know he was guilty, but we were still concerned that that jury was going to find him not guilty. So I went off on a big tangent, but it really points to how important institutions like the Carver are in that way.
That's not a tangent. This is what we're here for.
Right? Okay.
This is why we're coming together.
Yeah. So, but we have that responsibility, and we've been really looking at that in the programming that we're creating. Create and Heal came out of Black Lives Matter, and wanting to have a space where we have people be able to deal with the traumas that we're experiencing in a productive way. And I feel like we're going to be able to do that with this exhibit as well.